Because this is ultimately going to be a theory about how you and I and other humans connect with the world, so much of the work here, which will eventually culminate in your theory of conscious realism, which we'll get to, hinges on an understanding of consciousness. But I mean, with some exceptions, the consensus is that we have no real significant understanding at this point of just what produces consciousness, so the neural basis of consciousness. And I saw that, in the book, The Case Against Reality, you mention a discussion that you and Francis Crick had about how we ought to carry on in the absence of a theory. And what's the suggestion here? What's the connection? I guess I saw this as well. You see between the vitalism debate, the discovery of DNA, and then the neural basis of consciousness.
Right. So I'm very interested in consciousness and its relationship to brain activity, as are many of my colleagues. Francis Crick, when he was alive, Christoph Koch, and many of my friends and colleagues who are studying consciousness. We're all very interested in how my experience of the taste of chocolate and the smell of garlic and the color red are related to activity in visual cortex and frontal lobe cortex and so forth of the brain. There's clearly correlations. There's no doubt anybody who's serious in this field understands that there are serious neural correlates for conscious experiences. They're complicated. They're not simple, but there are neural correlations, and there are also correlations between certain kinds of strokes and certain losses of certain kinds of perceptual abilities. For example, if you have a stroke in area V4 in the left hemisphere, you can lose all color perception in the right visual field. So you have hemiachromatopsia. Now, that's a major change in your perceptual experience, your conscious experiences. So there's no doubt that there are neural correlates of consciousness, conscious experience. And there's no doubts that damaging the brain can fundamentally alter your perceptual experiences. The question, so those are clear data. The question is to have a scientific theory that explains this. And most of my colleagues, and that included Francis when he was alive, working on this problem, most of them assume that there's a causal relationship, that neural activity somehow is responsible for causing our conscious experiences. And of course, Francis freely admitted that he didn't know how that happened. He was coming up, he and Christoph and others were working on theories to try to explain that, but he freely admitted he didn't know, and his theories were just theories. But the idea was, just like with life and vitalism, we didn't understand what life was. How could just physical systems become alive? Was there some elan vital that made that happen, or what was the trick for life? And when Francis Crick, with the discovery of DNA, the double helix and so forth, with Watson, that all of a sudden unlocked a very big, keen insight into replication and other properties of life that made them far less mysterious. It began to demystify life, and it made vitalism seem much more implausible. Certainly not necessary to explain life. We could actually now just talk about DNA and the encoding of information inside the DNA. And Francis was hoping to do the same thing for consciousness that he'd done for life, to demystify it by finding, in this case, the neural basis. Instead of a double helix basis, there'd be a neural basis for consciousness. And I'm really grateful to Francis because I was starting to work on consciousness in the 1980s, but it wasn't kosher. You couldn't talk about it. So I wrote a book with Bruce and Chetan called Observer Mechanics. What I really wanted was basically mechanics of consciousness, but we couldn't call it that. We'd be dismissed. So, but after Francis said it was okay to talk about consciousness, then you could talk about consciousness. So hats off to Francis for really making consciousness on the table as a scientific discipline, and really helped to launch it. I mean, of course, there were people working on it before, but you had to sort of do it with a bit of disreputable stuff going on because it was consciousness. And so that was what Francis said. We just needed to continue to look at the neuroscience until we found that key empirical bit of data that broke the whole thing open. So that's what he was doing. And but my take is there are many theories of consciousness right now that start with physical systems like brains and neurons. So there's integrated information theory, which is not restricted to brains and neurons. It's more functional in general, but they are always looking at brains and neurons for their applications. There's orchestrated collapse of neuronal microtubule quantum states, Penrose and Hameroff. There's global workspace theory. There are many theories of consciousness that basically are looking for some aspect of neural activity or neural architectures that will explain the emergence of consciousness. So the fundamental idea is you start with unconscious ingredients, space-time and physical objects that are unconscious, electrons, protons, all the particles of the Standard Model. These are all unconscious, but when you get them complicated enough and in complicated enough systems, then somehow their functional properties give rise to consciousness. And that's, I would say, 99% of my colleagues in this field. That's the approach that they're taking. First, an important piece of data. There is no single theory on offer by anybody today. Integrated information theory, global neuronal workspace theory, orchestrated collapse of microtubule, quantum states, that can explain any specific conscious experience. And by that I mean, what is the specific pattern of integrated information that must be the taste of chocolate and could not be the smell of garlic? And I asked Tononi that question back in the 1990s, that when he came to UC Irvine and gave a talk to us. I asked him that question back then, and I asked him a couple of years ago. And the answer is, there's not any specific conscious experience right now that his theory can explain, and no theory. So I asked Stuart Hameroff in front of an audience a few years ago, give me one. So Stuart, orchestrated collapse in neuronal microtubule quantum states. So what is orchestrated collapse that must be the taste of whatever, the mint or whatever? Can you give me one? And I had to push on him 3 or 4 times before he finally said he couldn't give me one. And that's the state of play. And this is not, in science, we're used to having a few successes. Here, there are no specific conscious experiences, period, anywhere that can be explained by any of these physicalist theories, none. The best they can do is to say we have these correlations between these sort of patterns of activity and being conscious or not. And we can go into later on what I think about those. But that's different than saying, I can explain how this conscious experience emerges. There are no particular conscious experiences that can be explained. And so I think my take is that the failure is principled. These, by the way, these are my friends and colleagues. They're geniuses, many of them. They're brilliant. So they're not failing because they're dumb. They're failing because, unfortunately, their assumptions preclude any solution. You can't start with unconscious ingredients and boot up consciousness. And as soon as they recognize that, I think, and they start thinking about mathematical models of consciousness, qua consciousness, this field is going to explode because these guys are geniuses, guys in the general. So these people are geniuses, right? They're brilliant. And as soon as they, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you're starting with earth, air, fire, and water, you're just not going to understand chemistry. You can't build chemistry on earth, air, fire, and water. Doesn't matter how smart you are. And that's the problem we've got. Doesn't matter how smart you are. If you start with physical systems in space and time, you cannot boot up a theory of consciousness. It's just not possible. So, but I came to that conclusion kicking and screaming. I was a physicalist, and so was my own mathematical models, and then understanding what evolutionary theory entails. And then really understanding what I think high energy theoretical particle physicists now understand about space-time. That all of that together has convinced me, despite my emotions, even though my emotions completely rebel, intellectually, I'm completely convinced that consciousness cannot be derived from anything inside space-time.
So just to zoom out a bit, the idea that comes from Frick then is that continuing to search for NCCs in the same way that DNA revealed the mechanism for life's propagation and sophistication. And then, despite its lack, again, the search for NCCs of success in the most crucial dimension, it may eventually lead to an understanding of the source of consciousness. So that comes from Frick, but your thought is that we won't be able to do this because the whole framework is ill-founded on objects in space-time.
Right. So I'll be very, very clear about what. So I think that Francis is right. We should study the neural correlates of consciousness. Absolutely. And we should study neuroscience. In fact, I think neuroscience needs more funding, not less, because neuroscience is a lot harder than we thought. It's a much, much harder discipline than we thought when we look inside, through microscopes inside brains and we see neurons and synapses and so forth, that's what we're dealing with. No, that's a thin interface veneer of the reality we're dealing with. The reality is much, much more complicated. So we have to take what we see in terms of neural networks in the brain and reverse engineer it and ask, what is the much deeper and more complex reality behind that? That's how we're going to get our understanding of consciousness. So I agree with Francis, and Francis, he was a truly stunning genius. I mean, I had the privilege of knowing him in his late 70s and 80s, and he was quicker, sharper, had a better memory than I had in my 20s when he was in his, it was just truly stunning. Some people, not only did he, discover the genes, he had the genes. He had the right genes. So he was brilliant. But it's still the case that, of course, we need to study the neural correlates of consciousness. He's absolutely right about that. But the idea that once we understand those neural correlates, we'll understand how brain activity causes conscious experience. No, not at all. We're understanding an interface level correlation, but that correlation does not mean that there's a brain causation. Even the fact, someone might say, well, look, Don, you just said a minute ago that if you lesion area V4 in the left hemisphere, you will lose color experience in the right visual field. What better evidence of causation could you possibly have? And the answer is that that's no evidence of causation at all. There is clean correlation, but there's not causation. If I drag my file icon, if I'm writing a book and I drag my file icon to the trash can, I will lose my book, right? Serious damage has been done. Does that mean that the actual motion of the icon on my desktop to the trash can, that motion of the icon caused my book to be deleted? No, it didn't. That icon didn't cause anything. It's correlated, absolutely. There's a strong correlation between moving icons to the trash can and things disappearing. Strong correlation. Just like if you damage before, color disappears. So strong correlation, absolutely, but causation, absolutely not.